Mission Possible, where we explore the frontiers beyond individual scale. I'm Anne Braithwaite, a systems navigator, and I'm fascinated by the potential hiding within our systems. Unleashing that potential is the secret, I believe, to tackling our biggest challenges that are too vast for any solo hero to take on alone. Each week, I'm speaking with visionaries who've discovered that our greatest resource doesn't lie in individual brilliance, rather, it's the incredible capacity that exists between us all. Join us as we discover how to tap that potential by working beyond boundaries, beyond individual scale. This season, we're focused on the natural hazard sector, and living in New Zealand, it's a sector dear to my heart. After all, this is one of the most hazard-prone countries on the planet. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Eric Bird. Eric has a long and varied history, and I'll look forward to him just introducing himself. But what I really wanted to highlight and really enjoyed from our chat was his systems thinking approaches. Certainly this underpins his Mission Possible, how we connect up across the sector, across the system, and we can make a bigger impact. So without further ado, here's my chat with Eric. Eric Bird, welcome to Mission Possible podcast. It's such a delight to have you here today.
Thanks, Anne. Good to be here. Happy to talk.
Great. Would you like to give our listeners just a few words about your background? It's very interesting, and I think you're the best one to explain it.
Yeah, sure thing. I guess I would describe probably my background as I've spent my career doing complex, multidisciplinary engineering things. I kind of started out in infrastructure, electricity generation, worked at Meridian for a bit, and then after the Canterbury earthquakes, I spent 10 odd years as the technical director on one of the largest residential insurer programs, just looking after all the complex challenges that kind of emerged through the recovery. Then spent a couple of years after that working in a consulting kind of capacity, working for local government, central government around some of the things that we learnt from Christchurch, using some of that data. And most recently, I've taken a little bit of a tangent and headed off to Antarctica to help on the design of the new Scott base. I was the technical director on that project there. So, yeah, quite of an eclectic career, actually.
We love eclectic on this podcast, Eric, so you're in the right place. So thank you so much. We'll dive into all of those. I guess this series is about the natural hazard sector, and being New Zealand and a very shaky island or two or three, we know all about that sort of thing. And it sounds with your background, you'll be well versed to talk to us about those related hazards, and with your engineering and geology background, how that all ties together. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. To kick us off, I'd love to think about, what do you think at the moment in your field as it relates to hazards? What do you think the dominant sort of thinking is that's going on at the moment in the field? Beliefs, practices. You've got a huge amount of experience. So what's your feeling of where we're at the moment?
Yeah, it's a really interesting and really big question. Part of my challenge is, if you look at my career, I don't have a field. I trained as an engineering geologist. I've worked in kind of technical roles, kind of management type roles. I've worked in recoveries, Christchurch, and a little bit in the Kaikoura recovery. And then I've kind of worked on the planning side as a consultant, looking at land use planning stuff and doing work with local councils about future hazards. And I think one of the challenges we always have is that people's tolerance for and I guess knowledge of and awareness of a natural hazard is massively heightened once they've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
But until they've seen it, they're generally quite relaxed about it. And so one of the challenges, I think, in this whole kind of space is that everyone kind of thinks hazards are things that happen to someone else. So, Christchurch had liquefaction. I spent a wee bit of time after the earthquakes talking to various local councils around the country because the government made a bunch of changes to the building code around liquefaction and where we could build houses and what kind of design standards we could use to build houses. And talking to a lot of councils around the country, some of them just kind of go, oh, liquefaction, yeah, that's a Christchurch issue. We don't have that here. And they think they don't have it there because they've never seen it.
Yeah.
And you kind of go through, okay, well, wait a minute. What are the 3 ingredients you need for liquefaction? You need soft sediments laid down by rivers or estuaries and that kind of thing. You need lots of groundwater. Okay, you have that in your council probably somewhere. In lots of cases, right where your town is, because you build them beside a lake or a river or the sea. And you earthquakes. And, show me somewhere in New Zealand that doesn't have earthquakes.
Yep.
And so when you kind of put those 3 pieces together, people go, oh, actually, yeah, maybe we do have liquefaction. But up until that point, as far as they were concerned, it was a Christchurch issue and they didn't really need to think about it. And so
Yeah.
there's this kind of, this real almost disconnect between knowing what a hazard looks like and actually planning for it in the future. We're really good, I think, at kind of being focused on a whole bunch of other issues like the cost of housing or the need to release land for development, and not thinking about hazards. And then when we do have the hazard, suddenly everyone is focused on the hazard. Yeah, so I think, I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's this constant tension between knowing, I guess as a technical professional, knowing what could happen and trying to communicate that to people so that they actually plan for it.
Yeah. So listening to that, it's that old conundrum, isn't it, of the knowledge is there, the science is there, but we haven't felt it yet. And the potential sitting there latent, and until we've kind of experienced it, it's kind of hard to say, yeah, that'll happen to us. And as you rightly point out, most of the country where settlements are, for the vast majority of those, liquefaction is a potential reality, and it's just a question of time before we get hit by it.
Exactly. I mean, I remember early on in my career, I was originally trained as an engineering geologist, and I was talking to a much more experienced engineering geologist, and he kind of said, look, New Zealand is a spectacular country full of mountains and rivers and lakes and, amazing landscapes. We have those landscapes because we are right on two tectonic plates colliding. Mm-hmm. That's what gives us our valleys and our topography that gets pushed up and looks amazing. So it means that wherever you go in New Zealand, there are hazards. If you want something that doesn't have the kind of hazards that New Zealand has, you need to go somewhere like the outback in Australia. It's dead flat. And it's not very exciting. So the reality is we have these hazards in New Zealand just by a simple fact of our geographical location. Yep. And so I think it's quite easy to overlook that fact that these are all, no matter where you are in New Zealand, you have something as a potential. Liquefaction is one of them, but there are plenty of others as well.
Plenty of others, yeah. The irony, I had friends in Christchurch who went from Christchurch to Hamner Springs to get away from earthquakes, and you will know better than anyone that Hamner actually has a higher rating of risk on it than a Christchurch in that field, right? So higher building code and so forth.
I think that that Christchurch versus Hamner illustration is exactly kind of illustrates the point that because you've felt it in Christchurch, in your mind it's a Christchurch thing. But, you haven't felt it in Hamner, so therefore Hamner's safe. So, we know what the National Seismic Hazard Model looks like and how it rates seismic hazard across New Zealand. But until we've actually had that earthquake, we don't really think that something has the potential for an earthquake.
So some of the thinking that I think you were alluding to there, Eric, and let me not put words in your mouth, but it sounds like it's a deal with it later rather than a deal with it now, which is a really human thing when we've got an uncertain future outcome. So we go, well, it's uncertain. I've got all these other alligators snapping up my ankles that I need to deal with. That one can wait because we can deal with it later. We'll deal with it later. We'll deal with it later. And we're good at responding to crises. Almost there's a DNA of that's pretty cool. We'll do that. So we've got and how this flows on to work I've done in the sector over the years. It was Hugh Cowan, who you might have come across in the sector.
Yeah, no,
when he was at EQC, and I remember Hugh putting this phrase into my ear, and it stayed there, which is, do you want to pay now or pay later? By the way, paying later costs more, and we seem to be in a mindset or a belief that paying later is somehow the answer, because we've got so many, as you rightly point out. Is it housing crisis? Is it land use? Is it a multitude of other issues, cost of living, that take our attention away, and they're very salient and they're very real, and they don't have, and these other things feel like, well, they might happen, they might not. I can defer.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. It's that pay now or pay later kind of thing. It's what I guess working through the various recoveries, you realise that straight after the recovery, there's a real desire to make changes to make sure this never happens again. And so there's a short kind of window of time when a government can change policies and can change zoning and all that kind of thing, and people are tolerant to that. But if you look around the country and you look at any time someone has tried to do that before an earthquake, before a natural disaster, it is a massive uphill battle. What wording do you choose to put on people's limbs? How do you zone things? And how do you deal with that kind of conversation that you're inevitably going to have, which is, you've just devalued my land? And so one of the challenges I think we have as a country is that we save for retirement by buying a residential house and paying off the mortgage. So our retirement savings, all our savings, are in residential housing. And this seems to be quite a Kiwi thing, but it means that anything that potentially affects the value of that asset, that investment, we're very, very protective of. And planning for disasters in advance of disasters occurring creates this perception that you are devaluing someone's asset.
Whereas in the long run, what we're looking at is actually increasing value because we become more resilient. We're never going to be entirely immune, but we become more resilient. And if we could revalue our properties in terms of steps that we have taken to be more resilient, homes that are built in a more resilient way in more resilient places could in fact attract a higher value to them. But it's a long run game that most of us are not, sort of programmed to connect with. And our systems aren't designed for that.
Yeah, and you make a really, really good point there. I mean, let me give you a little story. I know a guy who worked at a construction company. He's quite a meticulous chap. He built a house in an area of Christchurch which is now red zone. But being the kind of guy he is, he did geotech, which was unheard of back in the 90s. And he put a decent foundation on this house, and he engineered the foundation much more than anyone ever said you needed to in those areas. When the earthquakes hit, his house was relatively undamaged. All the neighbouring houses were all tilted and broken. His house was a reasonably minor repair, and then the land got damaged, got zoned red zone. So he got paid out for a minor repair or the GV on his house, and the value of the land. And so you look at a case like that and you kind of think, well, actually the incentive therefore is to build the absolute minimum, because you don't pay any less in insurance. You've got a code compliant house. Your neighbours have got code compliant houses when they were built. You have no insurance advantage by overbuilding your house, and you have no real value. And people don't fall in love with the foundations on a house. They fall in love with the kitchens and the bathrooms. And so by putting money into stuff like that, there is actually no kind of return on that. All you get at the end of a natural disaster is a house that still works okay, which means, depressingly, you probably don't get as much money from your insurer. And so there's this kind of almost reverse incentive for people not to engineer things and remove the risk. If we had much more, we built a house here in Christchurch some years ago, and I remember talking to my wife and saying, like, if insurance wasn't cheap and wasn't easy to get in Christchurch, I mean, it's not easy to get, and it's not cheap, but it's cheap by world standard, you would actually design your house differently. You design it to not be damaged in an earthquake, and if it did get damaged, just kind of minor stuff that you could actually deal with. But I think in New Zealand, we're kind of, some of the way that we behave is kind of very much insulated by how accessible insurance is, and how cheap insurance is. I think if insurance sent a little more strong signals about what you've got, where it's located, then you might actually kind of, that might actually flow through into the value of the asset. People would be looking to buy something that's a little more robust, knowing that long term, that's more economic. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And we had Sam Ketley from Aon as a podcast guest a couple of sessions back, and we're starting to talk about how the insurance markets are moving. And we might find in this country before too long, insurance is harder to get and it is more expensive. Talking to some people here in Nelson, people buying homes are now ringing up to see if they can get insurance before they actually make the call on it and what kind of coverage they can get, because some of the insurance companies are backing out of some of the areas, particularly at the major infrastructure level. We talked at that level and investment at a country level, but at an individual level, it's there as well. It's really interesting to hear that informed person who's technically expert taking those steps, but as you're saying, not being compensated for it later because we've got such a broad brush approach to how we deal with the issues, and we aren't building in resilience as some measure of value in the economy. It's a similar argument that biodiversity makes, where we've got biodiversity on a farm. How do we value that versus strip farming all of the land and bringing our biodiversity down? So it's a similar kind of conversation around how do we value that stuff and how do we make it flow on to a return for individuals. Have you seen any shifts, Eric, in approaches? You talked about that one individual, but how in your wide range of coverage in the sector just broadly and in your different hats that you've been wearing, have you noticed any shifts that we could look to that start to indicate some positive impact or some things people are trying that are taking us in a new direction?
I guess, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that kind of gets done at policy level in government, and I think that and the stuff we kind of learned out of the Canterbury recovery is starting to push us in the right direction. I think that we are starting to get a little better at the way we understand our environments and the way we understand our potential kind of asset, where our assets are, our potential exposures. And so by that, I mean, I think in the wake of Canterbury, this kind of thinking about, hey, we need to be better at understanding where these hazards are. we need to have more robust flood models. We need to have more robust liquefaction models. We need to have a national seismic hazard model that gets updated on a regular basis as we kind of understand more and more. I think from that perspective, the science and the kind of hazard identification stuff is getting better and better.
Mm.
I think that the challenge just becomes how you implement that. But from a hazard perspective, I think we are getting much better as a country at kind of identifying where our hazards are. The challenge is just, what to do about that. Because I guess if you think about New Zealand, we're a small country by world standards. There's no reason we shouldn't have national databases, a national liquefaction model, a national flood model, a national seismic hazard model, all of those kind of things that are, they're the best of the thinking from the industry. They're the cutting edge of the science. We should have that because we're not a massive country where that's a really, really big ask. But it just requires investment and people prioritizing that. So I think that kind of stuff is quite exciting about the future of kind of hazard management, having much better tools. And I think we are getting, as we start to think much more about how we use data, how we collect data, how we store data, actually starting to know where our assets are, describe our assets better. And I'm sure Sam kind of talked about this when you had him on, around actually understanding where your exposures are and what the nature of those assets are, what they're worth, what their jobs are, all of that kind of stuff. I think that's something people are starting to get better at. And I think that's quite exciting because the more of that kind of stuff that we have in good data format, the more we can start to match that with the models that we have around hazards and start to actually look at scenarios and plan for things and do future land use planning and, actually start to think about resilience in the whole kind of ecosystem of assets and infrastructure.
Eric, it reminds
much more
me.
so.
It sounds like a real systems question. And as you were talking, it strikes me that the first most impactful behavioural shift thing is actually experiencing the hazard. And we get very alive to that, but it's short-lived, right? So we, I've got family who were in the Christchurch earthquakes who don't have grab bags still. And you go, really?
Yeah.
Why don't you have that? And we it's a human condition to kind of de-risk ourselves and say, oh, it won't happen to me. It's kind of one of our parts of our brains from way back where we go, yeah, that's all good. I'm a survivor sort of thing. It won't happen to me. Yeah. But the second most powerful things it seems to be in our current world and our current worldview is data. And because it's hard to argue with. And our current paradigm says, prove it. Prove it's there, prove it's showing. Evidence-based policy making has been around for a while now. What's going on? So that the data play seems to me to be a very strong one. And the more that is developed, the more it's coherent, the more it's joined up across the country and with other countries. I work a bit in Australia as well in this sector, and I'm hearing similar conversations around joining up of data. They've got a much more complex environment over there, both from a regulatory environment and division of public sector accountabilities. But this data play seems to be where we're at and is the driving force that we can use to change the conversation. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think data is going to be really, really powerful in terms of how we identify and manage hazards. The really important thing, though, when it comes to having lots of data is having people who really understand it and can interpret it properly. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. Out of the Christchurch earthquakes, we spent tens of billions of dollars on residential property and insurance claims. EQC spent a whole lot of money, and then when things went over cap, obviously the private insurers spent a whole lot of money. And so what that meant is you had tens of thousands, if not more, of kind of pieces of data about how your residential building stock had performed in an earthquake. And the losses that they'd experienced. Now, naturally, you'd go, okay, why don't I take that big data set, chuck it into a machine learning or AI environment and say, AI, tell me what the relationships are there. Where do I see my biggest losses? What is the cause of my greatest loss? And if you do that, and a couple of the universities did that, but you don't necessarily fully understand the underlying data set because you weren't kind of there when it got captured and you didn't see how it got built up, then the conclusion you'll come to, and this is a real example, is that the New Zealand building code has increasingly got more crap over time, and newer houses see bigger losses than older houses because that's there in the data. If you do a loss by age of house, you will see new houses see bigger losses. But actually, if you understand that data set, what you'll realize is that, no, wait a minute, what happened is when people settled in Christchurch in the early days, they went and they built their houses in sensible locations, not in wetlands.
Yep.
on gravel, on places that weren't swampy, that were, nice and dry. But as Christchurch expanded, we expanded out towards the coast and out towards other areas, and we went out into our eastern suburbs. And those are all the places where we get liquefaction. Because they were developed after, and we didn't develop the right foundations to deal with this issue of liquefaction and flood hazard. And so when the earthquakes came along, they hammered those areas with liquefaction, and all our newer houses, these type suburbs, just got completely wiped out. Places like Bexley, 1990s houses. And so you could naturally come to the conclusion there that the building code isn't doing what it's supposed to do, but it's actually not the building code at all. If you take out liquefaction out of that data set, and this is getting a little bit nerdy, but if you strip out all the pieces of land that experienced liquefaction, and you just look at loss per age based on earthquake shaking, what you'll see is actually the building code does a really good job. And increasingly, our buildings have become more and more resilient to earthquake shaking. And so actually older houses sustain much bigger losses from earthquake shaking than newer houses. But we also built new houses on liquefaction prone land. So that gave us a effect that made the data look like that the building code wasn't doing what it's supposed to. And so we looked at that post earthquake and some really interesting kind of insights like that actually, when it comes to shaking, the New Zealand Building Code and New Zealand Standard 3604, which is kind of the standard everybody uses to build houses in New Zealand, has increasingly become quite robust and is a really good tool for building robust houses in New Zealand, as long as you don't get liquefaction. And so it's kind of a case where if you understand the data, you can go and find all these relationships in the data, and it's really meaningful and it can inform policy. If you don't understand the data and you just throw it at an AI model, you're going to get relationships that actually don't help build good policy, because you're going to come to almost, in some cases, the opposite conclusion that you should be coming to. And so I think data is really, really grunty if the people who are analyzing it, manipulating it, playing with it, learning from it, know what they're doing and understand where it came from.
Eric, such a fascinating point. And it seems to me that it's the combination of understanding context as well, right? So we have an idea that earthquakes equal shaking, which they do. It's not an idea, it's a thing. And then you go, let's add in some other factors, right? And the liquefaction is an additional, almost cascading effect of different types of earthquake shaking, right? And so it's the effect on the type of land. I always think, I grew up for part of my childhood in Christchurch, and I'm going marshlands. It's a suburb. The clue's in the name, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
you go, there's probably something about that that people were onto. And so we add in these understandings and we layer it up. I think it's to your early point about the more we understand things, the more that we can layer in, well, what does this liquefaction mean? Wherever you are in those conditions that you mentioned before, if you have got, sandy soils, etc., you buy water, you've got a high level of water table and you're going to shake, then you've got liquefaction risk. So let's know that. Yep. Let's take the building code and say, well, what about the building code? Yeah, that builds better houses, but what's the end also that needs to go with that? What's the follow-on question, if you like? Will that be enough in this context? And if the context is marshlands or something like that, the building code might need, what is it we need to wrap around as a society? Is it better the building code that takes into account liquefaction, or is it some other thing around land use planning, in your view, that we need to be doing more work on?
Yes, to all of the above, I guess. Yeah, so one of the projects I was involved in after the earthquakes was making those building code changes to stop people building residential houses in the same way that we had in Christchurch on liquefaction-prone land.
Yep.
But at building consent stage, it's kind of too late, because you are relying on a builder to engage a geotech who is going to assess liquefaction potential. And so, throughout New Zealand, the standard builder engages just a sort of general technician to just bang a rod into a ground and say, yep, the ground's hard, you can build a house there. They're not looking for liquefaction potential. They're not looking for all that kind of stuff. If you do go down that route and start looking for those things, your investigation is going to cost you 10 times as much, 5 or 10 times as much. And so for your average residential homeowner, that's not acceptable. They don't want to invest $5,000 in geotech before they build a house. And so that kind of means that you need to push that level of effort back into the land development cycle as part of the resource consenting process, where hazards are considered at that point, and the type of land you're working on, and the developer does whatever they need to do to get that land to a reasonable standard, so when the homeowner comes in, they are building a relatively conventional house. And this is a conversation I've been involved in a number of councils when they're putting together their district plans. And they kind of say, well, why would I push hazard mapping and hazard investigation and everything into that land development area when I can just rely on the building code to make sure that they're doing it properly? But the problem with that is that pushes it into the realm of the residential builder and the mum and dad homeowner who are just trying to build a house, and it puts a lot of cost on them. It's a whole lot cheaper and a whole lot more effective to do that investigation for those hazards on a subdivision, on a suburb wide, on a district wide kind of basis, so that you kind of know where your key risk areas are. So yeah, I do think that there needs to be a reflection in the building code that you need to deal with this, but the most efficient and the most effective way to deal with these types of hazards is to do it at that land use planning and development kind of subdivision stage rather than later on. The building code has been changed to make sure that we build the right types of houses. I guess one of the other things that links into actually is it's really easy to beef up everything and say, oh, we've seen liquefaction, it's terrible, we should do it much better. And do it much better when there's insurance money on the table. Because after the Canterbury earthquakes, it was insurance money, and every insurance policy was open-ended, so it didn't matter whether the foundations were cheap or really, really expensive. The insurers had to pay. And so there was no real kind of sensitivity to cost. But when you're rolling out these kind of changes elsewhere in the country, before an earthquake or before a natural disaster, people are paying directly, and you don't kind of get that insulating effect, if you want to call it that, of an insurer pulling on their international reinsurance to pay for all of these regulatory changes we just made. Everywhere else in the country, you just pay. So more on your foundations equals more on the house build. Whereas in Christchurch, we were kind of, to a degree, insulated from that effect.
Yeah. And this is to your point about, I put the $5,000 into my foundations or into my bathroom cell homes, therefore I'm putting it into the bathroom.
Yeah.
We need the narrative to change to foundations cell homes, don't we?
Yeah, they're not that interesting though, to be honest.
They're not that interesting. No, anyone who's watched Grand Designs and says, how did they spend £150,000 on that pile of mud and concrete?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not a glamorous part of the house, but it's a pretty important part.
Pretty important part. Yeah. So Eric, let's just shift gears a little bit. All through that, I've heard quite a lot about, modelling. There's a whole lot of talk about AI these days, tech. When I was working with EQC a number of years ago now, and it was we probably almost crossed paths there, which was, they talked about Trevor up the driveway going to do the assessments of damage. And then the vision for the future was a wetter up your drain pipe, which was shorthand for using little microbots and AI to go crawling around your house to see what was going on. I'm wondering what your thinking is, or what you've been exposed to that you could share with us around moving tech or stuff from other fields even. I'd even go behavioural science to get people to change behaviours. What pings for you when I put those questions to you that are things we might draw on, we could get excited about for the future of this? Because it can be a bit of a doer topic, but it seems to me there's a lot of moving that we can get excited about. Yeah,
I guess when you put that kind of question to me, part of me goes, yeah, I'm excited about the technology that is to come. And the other part of me goes, yeah, it'll never work. Okay. And the reason I kind of say that is if you look at I don't know where insurance is kind of going. So, people are writing policies based on peak ground accelerations, for example. And if your building experiences a peak ground acceleration of more than, 0.2 G, then you automatically get a payout. The insurer doesn't come out and look at for damage or anything like that. They just pay you straight away. So it's a really easy policy to hold, and it's a really easy transaction for the insurer to do. That works really well, and those kind of innovations, you put a seismograph on your building, and that's really nice and simple. You're making use of the technology, all that kind of thing. Works really well when you are a commercial customer and you know the impact of that thing, that disaster, that acceleration on your building and on your business. And for you, it's just a commercial decision. So I think innovative insurance and all that kind of stuff and use of technology and assessment works really well if people are an informed kind of insurance policy holder and you're really informed about, commercial aspects of those kinds of things. When it comes to people's own homes, it's a totally different story. People won't be accepting, I don't think, of you going, oh, you saw this acceleration. Oh, we remotely sensed this. Here's your payout. Because of that kind of Kiwi thing of My house is my castle. It's my retirement savings. It's my investment. It's personal to me. I live here and I have an emotional attachment to it. It's not just a commercial transaction that I have in a commercial relationship that I have with my insurer. It's something much more, I don't know what the word is, much deeper than that. And so I think there's always going to need to be some level of good old-fashioned sending someone around to have a look at the damage, to talk to the homeowner, to hear their story, to have them point out the things that really concern them, and to take all those kinds of things into account. I don't think you can get away from that for residential insurance. I think for commercial insurance and infrastructure stuff, absolutely. And that's where the remote sensing, doing things based on PGA or whatever other measure you want to use makes a whole lot of sense in terms of post-disaster. But I think for residential, people care too much.
Yeah, it's a pretty emotive topic.
It's not too much, but yeah, it is. It's absolutely an emotive topic, yeah.
You internationally connected. Obviously, you're working with lots of different people on these, all come in contact. Are there things that we can look to in other jurisdictions, perhaps where people aren't kind of their quarter acre in their house, but out of date these days, but it's still the mindset of Kiwis, as you say, to own the house, it's a retirement plan and so on. Can we learn anything from other countries where perhaps the mindset is different, perhaps they're renters for life? I think of San Francisco, where you can't get insurance unless you're super wealthy, and if you're super wealthy you don't kind of need it because you can pay anyway. So I wonder if there's anything that you've picked up in your travels that we could look to that you go, actually, these some ideas that we might want to even consider try here in New Zealand, or maybe that's something we could look to and go, could we? Yeah,
I'm not sure. I guess one of the challenges is, and people like you, Gowan, were pretty fond of consistently pointing it out, because I think it is a really important point, which is New Zealand has the highest insurance penetration for housing in the world.
Yeah.
We have insurance. It's easy to get, it's relatively cheap, and it covers the whole asset. And so from that perspective, almost, I guess in a sense, New Zealand leads the world there, in that we, I guess, have taken as almost a policy decision for our country that we want our homeowners to be protected from large natural disasters. The challenge is, I think, that the way that we're building residential housing is changing. So you mentioned people living not in your standard quarter acre section, people not necessarily owning and just renting for life. I think that's kind of the reality, what will be increasingly the reality in New Zealand. We're going to be building adjoined townhouses, and we're not going to be having quarter acre sections, and we may not own those properties. And so the way that we build them is kind of important, and where we build them is kind of important, because I think, and I guess you'll never be able to measure it, but I do really think that the access that we have, the ease of access that we have to insurance has to a degree insulated us as a country from the real effects of natural disasters. So you mentioned San Francisco. If we were fully exposed to the reality of a disaster in our houses, we would build them differently, I think. We would be much more willing to make decisions that potentially protect our asset. I don't think as a country we'll ever move away from insurance. I think someone kind of gave the analogy of automotive insurance in New Zealand. Back in the 80s, you rang up and you said, I have a car, and they said, okay, that's this much. And progressively over the course of time, people started asking a whole lot more questions about your car. Okay, it's a Corolla. Okay, does it have any modifications? Where is it parked? All of that, all those kind of things. What variant is it? What model is it? All those kind of things. And all of that goes to build up a picture on the risk that particular car poses. We don't historically, and we haven't done that same thing with housing. And so I think if we were to do that, then we would start to send much more strong signals. That's not really an international example, though. So.
That's all right. No, because it's just comparing. What it says to me is we've talked about this protection gap entities, the PGE, the idea that EQC is that they provide a gap protection between what you can get in the insurance market and what the cost of this damage is, and then it still flows on beyond the EQC to the Crown, for example, for further payouts and top-ups. So neither of those on their own, EQC or the private insurers, was sufficient to cover the Christchurch earthquakes. We still had to draw on other reserves from the Crown to get us through that.
There's a quite an interesting link, I think, also with the banks in New Zealand. Kind of having worked in various consulting firms, and some of these consulting firms do quite a lot of natural disaster work, and people in them are always saying, why aren't we talking to the banks? Why aren't the banks more interested in this? And if you actually go and talk to the banks generally are pretty relaxed about natural hazards and those types of things in New Zealand, because their lending is covered by insurance.
Mm-hmm.
if the banks didn't have full cover and kind of open-ended, well, it's not open-ended cover, but if they didn't have full cover, then they would be much more worried about their exposure, but they're not, because they don't need to be.
Mm.
And so I think, I don't know, insurance is so important because it means that in New Zealand we are insulated from some of these things, but at the same time it does insulate us from some of the realities, and that doesn't necessarily drive all the right behaviours.
Yeah, which might come back to bite us right in the future. So it's really interesting you bring up the banking sector, because I think that works at both ends of it. Working back in the day with another project, we were talking about bank lending for building of houses. So the way that the lending process works, and I'm not up to date with it, so others listeners might be able to correct me on this, but it was built on, here's the foundation, got some walls, got a roof, now you can have some more money, build this, and it's not actually helping us build the most resilient home. So that's the first thing that came into my head. There are better ways of building now that the lending process hasn't aligned with necessarily. So we might not be building our homes in the best way. Your point to insurance is, what if you're lending without the requirement to get insurance? So I'm waiting to hear the story of the person who wants to buy a house and no one will insure the house and they need a mortgage. What does that do to us? How does that finance work? And And then to link it back to your earlier point and jump in after this one, which was, let's say the geotech costs $5,000. What's your annual insurance policy costing you? Say over a couple of years, you'll quickly pay for that. If the policy's prices can come down, you'll pay for that geotech pretty quickly, even if it does go all the way back to the individual, right? And I agree with your earlier point that this should be at a much more macro level than the individual homeowner. So just some reflections on what you were saying there, Eric.
Yeah, and I think it's quite important to kind of think about the challenges on that large scale and just kind of identify all of those interrelationships. Because I think once you start to do that, you can start to see why some of the outcomes that we've been getting, why we get them.
Indeed.
And I guess one of the other kind of challenges I've been thinking about is New Zealand has a cost of housing challenge. Our housing is not cheap. And so there's this constant tension between the cost of developing land and building housing and whether we make that resilient. And we saw aspects of that in the building code changes that were made recently around just the energy efficiency of homes. And there was backlash on that. Our houses are getting too warm. I haven't experienced too many New Zealand houses that are too warm. But there's tension between what it costs us to build a house and how resilient and how livable those houses actually are. Yeah. And I think we have a tendency in New Zealand to listen, I would say, probably too much to builders and developers. They have very much a vested interest in some of these discussions, I think.
Yeah. Eric, I think that's a perfect segue to our kind of wrap-up question, which is, let's imagine you could pull together any group of people that you wanted to, and you had your moonshot idea for New Zealand that might right now feel really impossible, but could be so transformative if we achieved it. And what might that look like for you?
Well, for me, I think it would look like a whole, and you mentioned this being a kind of a systems problem, and so I think it's a systems solution. And I think it would start with, let's kind of paint utopia almost. I would say it's New Zealand that is putting good investments into science. So we are capturing all the information that we need through kind of our science disciplines. We're understanding our hazards well, and then we're transferring that knowledge into good national models, flood models, tsunami models, climate change, coastal erosion, liquefaction, national seismic hazard models, all of that kind of stuff. And so we have good models that are continually being updated the more we find out about things. And those models are directly informing policy at a national level in terms of what is our societal tolerance for natural hazard risk. What are we going to accept as a society, rather than kind of just inherently putting it into our building code and into our RMA and allowing each council to define what their tolerance is. We've got this ongoing conversation about what's our societal risk tolerance, and all of these models are informing that. And so when we buy or we develop or we build in a certain area, we kind of know as a country what level of risk we are taking when we do that. And so we can kind of balance this cost of developing land and cost of building housing versus the level of resilience that we are exposing ourselves to, or the level of risk that we're exposing ourselves to. And then from there, once you know about the hazards, all your policy settings are related to the actual risk that you're prepared to take, and then flowing all the way down through to your New Zealand building code, your New Zealand standards that say this is what you build in these areas and this is how you build it. And you've tested all of those properly against, the cost of doing that, the resilience that you get out of it, and what your kind of total cost to the country is when you do eventually get a disaster. I think if you kind of created a systems approach that looked like that, you'd be actually managing hazards in a way that really takes into account their actual cost to New Zealand versus hoping they don't happen, doing the cheapest thing you can because of the imperatives that are in front of you right now, and then complaining when something goes wrong at the end and saying, I can't believe whoever did it like that. They didn't change the code. They allowed development to happen in that area, whatever. I think if you did that, took that kind of holistic approach, then you'd have a much more kind of sensible outcomes. And then I think that's probably the kind of the management of hazards piece. And then there's another kind of piece that falls out of the back of that is, and then when you do get something that happens, what do you do? And there's another kind of piece there which says, and then when we do get something something happens, because we have good models and they deal properly with the probabilities of things occurring and they look at the statistical distribution of damage that you might get, when something does happen, we have a really good feel for what it's going to look like. And then we have a kind of another framework that looks at what's the nature of the community damaged, what's the complexity of the damage, how intense is it, what's the impacts on infrastructure, and we kind of structure our recovery in a way that looks at all of those variables and structures a recovery in a way that matches that. Because the way that Christchurch played out was quite different from the way that Kaikoura played out. The way that the next one will play out will be different again. And it's almost like Christchurch, we tried, let the insurers do it or make the insurers do it. We weren't that happy with that. Kaikoura, we just threw cash at everything. That's got some issues too. People were more happy because they got cash, but did all the houses get fixed? And so I do think that recovery piece is an important thing to think about, as well as just the front end managing the hazards. Sorry, very long-winded way of answering that question.
It's a super description, I think, of the collection of the system that we need to think about, sort of start to top to tail. At the heart of that, for me, the phrase that popped for me was our societal tolerance to natural hazard risk, getting that known as a society, as a collective, knowing what that is and working to that. Of all of the things that you've described, if you could have a group around you that had all the right people in it, from all the right sectors and places and positions of ability to do anything with that, take action, what's your first step that you would love to be part of that you could see? What's your mission possible that would be a step forward in getting to that utopia that you described? That might currently feel a bit of a stretch, but imagine if we did it.
It's a really good question, and I don't know. I think there's a bunch of different aspects that. Now, I don't want to be too controversial, but I watched, I guess, the playing out of the National Seismic Hazard Model update, and it got tricky, and it got political. I think as a country we need to figure out how to do stuff like that better, and so I do almost think that maybe the start of this is to have a group of people that are not necessarily politically motivated, that just look objectively at hazards. And that societal risk thing is a key aspect of this. What is our risk tolerance as a society to a tsunami, to an earthquake that damages this? And so I think that's probably, I don't know, that to me feels like one of the key steps, making sure that we can put the science and the engineering out there without, I don't know, I'm kind of oscillating because...
Leading with scientific interest rather than the interests of the day? Would that be a way of putting it?
I think so, but I guess, you can't put it out there in isolation without anything because that tends to scare people. And so it's this whole aligning science and engineering knowledge with good policy-making procedures so that you are actually enabling people to become familiar with what the science and what the engineering is saying, but you're not automatically just jumping to the conclusion about what it means for me in my house. So you're enabling that to just constantly be being discussed in kind of key settings so that people are aware that, the science changes, the engineering changes, our understanding of hazard changes, and these are going to correspondingly change the way we set policy, the way we allow which areas that get developed. And so I think if you can kind of get that first piece right and then commit to being a country that is evidence and fact-based in the way that we deal with these things, then you're starting to allow it to, occur in a slightly more structured way. slightly more informed way, rather than just each person doing their piece, and some of those being disconnected to the other pieces.
Eric, thank you so much. I love your ambition there. It's no small challenge, as we are well aware. And just you've given us some really great ideas about where we might, as a country, start to put a bit more energy and time and thinking. I really love your concept of understanding as a society, genuinely as a society, not as a group of experts or as a government of the day, but genuinely as a society, this is where we are. And we keep that alive and well for generations to come, because that will evolve over time. So what a wonderful moonshot idea. Yeah. Eric, it just leaves me to thank you for being here today. I've been really enjoying our conversation. It could go on much longer, I'm sure. So thank you so much for being a guest here on Mission Possible.
Thanks very much for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation.
What a great conversation with Eric Bird. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. As a bit of a history fan, I often see things in the past that our forebears knew and already figured out long before we came along that can teach and inspire us today. I like to call this old ways, new ways. Today's moonshot idea was from Eric Bird, and it reminded me of what happened in Mesopotamia. And I'm going way back to the Sumerians. They already had sorted some of the things that Eric was talking about. Indeed, 5,000 years ago, they had a systems approach to flood management. Their scientists of the day meticulously documented patterns of river behaviour, observations, flood cycles, and created multi-generational data sets about the Tigris and the Euphrates. Their knowledge directly informed their urban planning policies. Now, they probably didn't call it that back then, but it's exactly what they were doing. Where cities were built were on carefully elevated levees, and they even built up special tells which they built on to get them out of the water and out of harm's way. Engineers implemented that science on an integrated network of dams and canals that were thousands of miles, I'll say that again, thousands of miles of flood barriers. Most impressively, they embedded that environmental knowledge through their cultural memory, through their myth stories like Gilgamesh, and through other stories of history that ensured that crucial information was passed down from generation to generation long before we had what we have today and our impressive data sets and knowledge sharing capacity. So if they can do it, I figure we can too. This comprehensive system that they had, connecting observation, policy and implementation, offers a timeless model for us in modern times facing into those challenges. Kings like Hammurabi over the years instigated policies and legal codes that had specific water management provisions in them, including maintenance and flood damage liability. Really modern concepts, and yet we're going back 5,000 years. Elevated city mounds were built. They were called tells, and they elevated the buildings above those floodwaters. Periodically, these were destroyed, and they built up, and they rebuilt them, and they destroyed them on purpose to make them even better. I'll say that again. They destroyed them on purpose to make them better in the long term. Maybe there's a message there for our climate adaptation work. Final thought on the Mesopotamians and how clever they were. Their architecture incorporated specific techniques to make buildings more resilient to environmental damage. This included things like cones of coloured stone and terracotta panels and clay nails that were driven in to create a protective sheath around their buildings. They both decorated them and made them resilient. So taking that whole systems approach, everything from what was built to where it was built, and the scientific observation of the day that involved special scientists, they weren't called that back then, and daily observations, the local knowledge, and passed down by generations. I think there's something we can learn from that. It's just another example of a historical solution to problems that we still deal with today. Thanks for putting your head together with ours. As those who went before us knew, there's nothing we can't do together, even if we haven't done it yet. Let's go beyond the individual brilliance and harness our collective capacity to do great things. I'm Anne Braithwaite. This is Mission Possible. See you next time.